Andrei Chikatilo, the Rostov Ripper. By Jacopo Pizzon and Giacomo Brunoro. Chapter 1. Monster. How did he escape us for so long? These were the words of the Russian investigators who arrested Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov, in November 1990. This simple and banal question encompasses all the horror and drama of the story we are about to tell you. In fact, Chikatilo was not a refined serial killer, an elegant criminal, or an evil genius. No, none of this. He was simply an ordinary man, a modest Soviet teacher like many, but who, unlike others, could not control an irrepressible impulse. Some have called him a poor monster, a definition that fully conveys the idea of how gray and anonymous he was. Let's read how Police Major Viktor Denisenko described it. It is very difficult to explain my impressions. While we were looking for the killer, we all hated him. He seemed like a monster to us, a horrible, demonic figure. And instead, once captured, Chikatilo turned out to be a gray, insignificant person. He aroused not horror, but repugnance and skepticism. How could such an insignificant man sow terror across the country and act with impunity for over 10 years? This question has not yet been answered and perhaps never will. In my opinion, a lot can be explained if one admits a duplicity of his nature, or if you like, a split of personality. And it is a doubling that does not manifest itself externally, it is hidden in the depths of the psyche. His bestial and inhuman actions continued undisturbed for more than a decade, in the end 54 confirmed victims of the Rostov butcher, in a climate of social decay that leaves one amazed. If everyone had done their duty, most likely today we would not be here talking about this tragedy, but unfortunately we have seen that this is a detail that many investigations on serial killers have in common. It seems incredible, but these individuals managed to commit unthinkable actions in a climate of almost total impunity. They take advantage, often unconsciously, of sensational errors by the police or trivial inattention. In fact, sometimes it takes very little, for a murderer to get away with it. The most disturbing aspect of this whole horrible story is in fact how Andrei Chikatilo was able to act undisturbed by taking advantage of the rubble of a dissolving state, slipping into the folds of an absurdly bureaucratic system that made everything slow and cumbersome. Journalist Peter Conrady has defined this whole affair as one of the greatest investigative errors in history, and as we will see, this statement is certainly acceptable. Perhaps if Mikhail Gorbachev hadn't started perestroika in 1987, today we will know little or nothing about the actions of one of the most cruel and ruthless serial killers in history. Chikatilo was in fact the first serial killer in that area of the world since, after his arrest and his death sentence, cases of serial killers multiplied in the countries of the former Soviet Union. However, none of them can be compared to the butcher of Rostov, and not so much for the brutality of his actions, but because with that mad look of his, with his way of behaving during the trial, with his chilling confessions uttered in an absolutely candid way, with that blank expression and impassive alternating with his famous and diabolical smiles, Andrei Chikatilo has quickly become a true icon of evil. This ruthless serial killer also had a shameless luck on his side, luck that incredibly protected him on more than one occasion and that gave birth to a black legend, as if it were a monster in the guise of a man dressed in a diabolical aura. His arrest was very useful to the Russian police who, by analyzing the many mistakes made during the investigation, were able to improve their practices to become more efficient in such cases. The same applies to the psychologists who were able to study this man thoroughly to understand as much as possible the horrors hidden in his sick mind, then putting their intuitions to good use in several similar cases. The result is an impressive portrait of madness, a merciless photograph of the bestiality of human nature, a clear and degrading image of the very essence of evil. Chapter 2. Soviet Education. Andrei Chikatilo was born in Yabloknoy, a small town lost in the Ukrainian countryside, in 1936. The world in those years was experiencing very difficult moments that soon resulted in the Second World War. For Ukraine in particular, that is a dramatic period to say the least, after the Great Famine that hit the region between 1932 and 1933. We are talking about an epical event that deeply traumatized the Ukrainian people, literally starving for Stalin's crazy politics. The country was reduced to such a state of desperation that there were several episodes of cannibalism, especially against children. And we are not talking about exaggeration or propaganda, but about documented historical facts that really happened. Fortunately, in 1936 the region is slowly leaving that nightmare behind, but the wounds are still fresh and it is impossible to forget the horror experienced by the population. Andrei Chikatilo himself, the protagonist of our Black story, had a cousin who, during the Great Famine, was kidnapped and eaten by the desperate neighbors. Chikatilo's mother kept repeating to little Andrei that story which, in the mind of that lonely and frightened child, soon becomes a real obsession. Imagine for a moment what it can be like to grow up hearing such a story over and over again. And we are talking about a little boy of just 5 or 6 years, or a simple child who is going through a very delicate phase of his formation. Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, who was able to study Chikatilo's case in depth by interviewing him repeatedly, believes that this moment was fundamental for the psychological development of the future killer. What Chikatilo experienced during his childhood was terrible. When he started talking to me about the story of his life about him, it was already the story of his illness. Despite everything, Chikatilo's family, however poor, was not miserable. His father, Roman Chikatilo, with his work as a farmer was able to satisfy the basic needs of his wife and children. In such a complicated context, one cannot certainly speak of a happy childhood for little Andrei, who personally suffered the terrible horrors of the Second World War. The German bombings, in fact, devastated the region, which for a long time remained occupied by the troops of the Third Reich. Little Andrei lives alone with his mother while his father is busy at the front. The woman, however, humiliates him and violently beats him, especially because the poor child cannot restrain himself and often pees on the only bed in the house and is occupied by mother and son. Nocturnal incontinence will be a real drama for little Andrei, who will continue to wet the bed until the age of 12. The future monster of Rostov will later say that those years have profoundly marked him and besides, it could not have been otherwise. What influences him is above all the Soviet propaganda, which tells the adventures of the Russian partisans in the woods. For the first time he begins to dream of killing the Germans in the woods just like the partisans mentioned in the propaganda. He does not realize that he is creating within his mind a complex and structured imaginary that in the years to come he will come to reconstruct, unfortunately in an even more brutal way. The war ends, but for little Chikatilo things do not improve much, quite the contrary. The father returns home in 1949 after being a prisoner of the Germans. In Stalin's Soviet Union, however, having been prisoners of war was considered a real fault. Infamous as a traitor and collaborator, the poor man is soon condemned to social contempt, a factor that further conditions the development of little Andrei. For years the boy had been fabling about his father, thinking of him as a hero fighting the Nazis. Now he is faced with a man destroyed by the violence of war and moreover marginalized by that society for which he fought and suffered. Little Andrei is a shy, closed child. He struggles to bond with his peers and according to everyone, he always has a dreamy expression, as if he lived in a world all his own. He is very ashamed of his myopia, which certainly contributes to that expression of which we have just talked about. But with age he seems to have overcome the many problems of his childhood. He is in fact nicknamed by his friends, Andrei the Strong. During his adolescence he gets closer and closer to the Soviet Party, and to the Soviet ideology which, for that boy on the sidelines, represent the only lifeline. At just 16 Chikatilo is director of the school newspaper and member of the school committee, and he also boasts that he knows the names of communist leaders from all over the world by heart. When Stalin died in 1953, he was the one who read the very long and rhetorical official homage published in Pravda to all his schoolmates. Seen in retrospect, these attitudes can be read as an attempt by the young Chikatilo to somehow overcome his profound shyness, a system for building a solid armor that allows him to overcome the social unease that he perceives around him. Andrei thus proves to be a decent student and manages to achieve the diploma, even if he does not pass the Moscow University entrance exam. Not being admitted to university comes as a shock to Chikatilo. Up to that moment, in fact, he had staked everything on education. Resentment and suspicion begin to harbor within him. He is convinced that he has not been admitted due to the infamy of his father, who has returned from the front with the ignoble mark of traitor to the people. Of course, the reality is completely different. Chikatilo was passed in the entrance exam by students more prepared than him. Remember that the selection to enter the Moscow University in those years was ruthless. There are no mysteries or plots, as is normal, but Chikatilo's sick mind builds a real castle of fantasies to justify that defeat. He could easily enroll in another less prestigious university, but instead he prefers to opt for a more modest technical course. An episode from those years, however, shows how the problems were already very deep for the future butcher of Rostov. Tatiana Naryzhna, a fellow student of him, has in fact fallen in love with him. She is 17 and he is 19, and on several occasions the two young boyfriends try to have a complete sexual relationship, which is very normal for boys of their age. As Naryzhna herself will later tell, however, they never succeeded because at the last moment Chikatilo always pulled back, now making one excuse, now another. Things are even worse when Chikatilo is sent by the Communist Youth League to work on the telephone lines in the city of Nizhny Tagil, 1,200 kilometers east of Moscow. In fact, for him it is the first work experience for the boy, and this time too it is a dramatic experience. Beyond the fact that he is not prepared to withstand the extremely rigid temperatures of the place, he does not have the right clothes, so much so that on more than one occasion he risks being frozen. The real problems arise with the local girls. Chikatilo repeatedly tries to have sexual relations with different girls, but never manages to conclude. He suffers from severe erection problems, and the fact of being laughed at by his companions for those failures of him certainly does not help to improve things. His paranoia grows more and more, and he becomes convinced that everyone in Nizhny Tagil is making fun of him for his helplessness. It is a very difficult period for that young man of high hopes who came from the south of the country and who, after an initial period of adaptation in which he seemed to everyone nice and cordial, falls into a state of deep depression. In 1957, Chikatilo left for military service, which at the time lasted 3 years in the Soviet Union. During this period, the paranoia of the future Rostov butcher explodes. Life in the army in Russia was very hard, but for the young Andrei, the real drama was his relations with his comrades. His problems with women exile him into harsh loneliness, as all his fellow soldiers mock and humiliate him for this reason. The rumor begins to circulate that he is even homosexual, a factor of further ghettoization and bullying within a profoundly male chauvinist world such as the military one. After a series of traumatic experiences, Chikatilo decides not to go out with his fellow soldiers anymore. He spends his evenings locked in his room, growing more and more of his paranoia. During the years of conscription, the future serial killer also lives an experience that will remain indelibly etched in his mind and which, most likely, has a detonating effect for the monster that had so far remained hidden inside him. During an approach with a girl, there is a moment of tension. The girl, who at that moment is hugging Chikatilo, tells him plainly that she is bored with him and she doesn't want to know any more. But Chikatilo, despite her protests, continues to hold her tight for a few long and interminable seconds. That sudden feeling of absolute domination over another person, mixed with the fear and bewilderment that he can glimpse in the girl's terrified eyes, suddenly provoke unexpected sexual excitement in Chikatilo. Of course, this is an episode that may seem insignificant, but it is the spark that ignites the association between violence and sex, domination and excitement in Chikatilo's head. For the first time, the future butcher from Rostov perceives that violent control over other people causes him sexual arousal. Chapter 3. The Years of Thaw. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is profoundly changing. After Stalin's death, the thaw began very slowly and Nikita Khrushchev imposed a new course on the country. After completing his military service, Chikatilo then moved to Rodionovo, Nesvetievsky, a small town north of Rostov. He gets a job as a telephone engineer and lives what seems to all intents and purposes happy years. The passage from the countryside to the city for Chikatilo is experienced as a huge leap in quality. After an initial period spent in a one-room apartment, he is soon joined by his father and sister as well. Even in the Soviet Union, as in much of the Western world, people move en masse from the countryside to the cities. The myth of progress, technology, and a better future convince millions of farmers to leave their native countries to move to large or small urban centers which, between the 1960s and the 1970s, experienced a period of enormous growth. Meanwhile, Chikatilo's relations with the opposite sex do not improve much. He is always very shy and cannot find a girl even if, despite everything, his life seems to have become almost normal. All this up to an episode that will have a heavy impact on Chikatilo's already deeply troubled soul. During a lunch break with colleagues, Chikatilo wants to go for a walk in the woods. In reality, he wants to go masturbate to appease the ardent desires that disturb him night and day but which, due to his pathological shyness, he never manages to vent with a woman. Chikatilo then goes into a grove, and when he thinks he is out of sight of his colleagues, he starts masturbating. Unfortunately for him, his workmates see him very well because, unlike him, they are not short-sighted. As soon as they notice what he is doing, they start teasing and mocking him in a blatant way. Because of this episode, from that moment Chikatilo will be constantly mocked in the workplace, and this, of course, can only increase his paranoia and his sense of inadequacy exponentially. Meanwhile, the sister realized that Andrei has serious problems with the other sex, and so in 1963 she tries to get him out with a friend of hers. The experiment attempted by Chikatilo's sister works. Faina Odnichov, this is the girl's name, is pleasantly impressed by the boy's reserved ways, by the fact that unlike many of his peers he is not perpetually drunk. Chikatilo drank very little, and by his prudent and sober behavior from a point of view. Sexual sight. Unlike all the other boys, in fact, Chikatilo does not try to take her to bed immediately, and this detail makes a very good impression on Faina. The meeting organized by the sister succeeds perfectly, so much so that within a few months the two get married. From that moment on, however, the problems began. Chikatilo had told the girl that he wanted to wait until the wedding night to complete their act of love, but then once married, the two are unable to have complete relations. Of course, the fault lies with Chikatilo's impotence, but, after more than a week, in the end the two newlyweds manage to have a first sexual relationship. It is an extremely fast relationship, but it is already something, Faina must have thought. Once the shyness of her husband is overcome, things will change, of this the woman is convinced. Unfortunately for her, the situation never changed and the sexual relations between the two spouses always remained very scarce and unsatisfactory. Nevertheless, the couple will be able to give birth to two children, Ludmila and Yuri. From the outside they look like a perfect couple, a happy family. Chikatilo even went back to studying, enrolled at the University of Rostov, and in 1971 obtained a degree in Russian language and literature. The new qualification allows Chikatilo to move to Novoshakhtinsk and start teaching. Just when things seem to turn for the best, however, for Chikatilo comes the cold shower. His shy and reserved nature becomes a problem when he has to teach in front of the pupils. He is made fun of by the kids from the first day of school. There is nothing to do, he cannot get respect from his pupils who, on the contrary, take advantage of him in a cruel way. In short, the mornings in class for the teacher turn into a real nightmare. The frustration accumulated at school then explodes in the home. Sexual relations with his wife have now practically disappeared, and Chikatilo is often completely alien to family life. The real problem, however, is another. For the first time, Chikatilo has dozens of very young boys and girls at its complete disposal. A world of fantasies and perversions opens up in front of him, so much so that soon his attitudes towards the students begin to become too affectionate, to put it mildly. Especially for the girls of the Chikatilo school, it becomes a nightmare. The professor got into the bad habit of unexpectedly appearing inside the girls' dormitories, the Russian schools of the time were very similar to our colleges, given that many of the students came from the most distant and disadvantaged regions. The sight of the half-naked girls literally drives him crazy, and in short, that strange professor begins to collect repeated accidents. There is a lot of embarrassment around him, because the rumor is now circulating among the boys that it is better not to trust that professor. In May 1973, Chikatilo can no longer restrain himself. He has organized an excursion to the river with his students, and everyone is bathing peacefully. He swims to a 15-year-old student of his and begins to blatantly harass her. He doesn't let go of the girl and touches her repeatedly, so much so that the poor girl starts screaming in fear and shock. At that point, however, instead of letting go of her, Chikatilo gets even more excited and squeezes her more and more, until the intervention of some students forces him to stop. Once he even punished a student by hitting her with the ruler on the buttocks until, exhausted by her excitement and perversion, he ejaculates in his pants. He has completely lost his mind and locks the door, determined to continue abusing the girl who, fortunately, manages to escape from the window since they were in a classroom on the ground floor. From that moment on, the episodes of harassment towards pupils begin to repeat themselves with increasing frequency. By now Chikatilo has lost all inhibitions. What literally leaves him stunned is that although the situation is now unbearable, no action is taken against that very particular professor. When he is too much, however, and in fact in January 1974 the headmaster summons Chikatilo and strongly advises him to resign, otherwise he will be fired. By now the reputation of him is too cumbersome, the rumors circulating about the school and about that pedophile professor are no longer tolerable. But things change little. For Chikatilo it is simply a matter of finding another school in which to start the usual perverse routine again. Unfortunately for him, let's put it this way, Chikatilo is hired at a technical school in Novochakhtinsk. Here the students are all over 15 years old and the teacher almost seems to fear them. Precisely on this occasion the fearful and cowardly side of Chikatilo emerges clearly. He does not dare to put his hands on teenagers, he is too afraid of their possible reactions, especially those of the children of minors who at 15 have an already developed build and are able to physically overcome him. He prefers smaller boys and girls, more defenseless, weak subjects, and over whom he can exercise absolute control. In 1978 he changed his school again, this time for a reduction in staff. He is hired as a custodian in another technical school in Shakhty, a city not far from Novochakhtinsk. Here he combines another of his. In fact, he sneaks into the boys' dormitory at night and starts practicing oral sex to a 15-year-old student who is sleeping peacefully. It goes without saying that chaos breaks out in the dormitory, but that doesn't stop Chikatilo from returning a few days later. But now the boys are prepared and are chasing him violently. Again, in a truly inexplicable way, no action is taken against him. Chapter 4. The Spider's Lair. Despite the episodes we have just told Chikatilo to Shakhty, he is fine. His wife is also hired in the same school, and so the whole family moves there on a permanent basis. At that time Chikatilo buys a small studio apartment that seems abandoned. The house was in fact an unlivable shack, but the former professor has no intention of living there. That apartment will become his playroom, his torture room. Chikatilo now is no longer satisfied with harassing young people, he feels the need to push his crazy perversions even further. Furthermore, the scandals are starting to be too many and it is clear that if he continues like this sooner or later he will end up in jail. He therefore feels the need for a place to act undisturbed. And then thanks to his working hours Chikatilo has a lot of free time, he takes the opportunity to wander around the city in search of victims to take to his new lair. On the evening of December 22, 1978, little Elena Zakotnova runs into that gentle-looking man. He almost looks like a kindly-mannered grandfather. The girl is just 9 years old and she is running towards the house because she can no longer restrain herself. She has to go to the bathroom and she is afraid of having it on. At a certain point the little girl can't take it anymore. She is determined to stop and do it on the street. That nice and caring grandfather, however, kindly offers her to go to him. she lives a few steps from there and she can use her bathroom. As soon as they enter what is actually little more than a shack, Chikatilo transforms. The affable and kind expression of his grandfather disappears from his face, and the demonic and bestial expression of the monster appears. He jumps on top of the girl, covering her mouth to keep her from screaming, and tries to rape her. Once again, however, his body betrays him, and despite the fact that he was making one of his greatest dreams come true, Chikatilo cannot get an erection. It is a defining moment in the life of that gray former Soviet professor, and for all the poor victims of him. While he unsuccessfully tries to rape the little girl, Chikatilo injures her, and poor Elena Zakotnova begins to bleed. In front of the sight of blood, the monster comes to orgasm, the most intense of my life, as he himself will later declare. At that moment the man and his perversions disappear, and only the monster remains. Chikatilo clearly realizes that sex is not enough to satisfy his insatiable appetites. All those small and big perversions he had carried out up to that moment were nothing for him, compared to the supreme ecstasy of blood. He quickly takes the knife he always carries with him, and stabs the poor woman in the belly. The moment he stabs the girl Chikatilo, he ejaculates again and loses all inhibitions. He massacres the body of his victim and eventually, to end his agony, strangles her. Not even death stops the monster, who slips his hands into the bowels of that still hot corpse and gets excited again by contact with the blood and entrails of little Elena. This modus operandi will be repeated almost identical in all subsequent murders, in some cases with the variant of post-mortem cannibalism. The act of stabbing his victim will always bring Chikatilo to orgasm, as if the blade were somehow replacing his member, in an unstoppable psychotic delirium. After the murderous rampage, however, Chikatilo returns to calm and realizes that he has made it big. He absolutely has to get rid of the corpse, and he does so by throwing that battered body into a nearby river, after which he escapes. However, he forgot the light on in his house and did not realize that by moving the corpse he stained the snow with blood. After 2 days of frantic searches, the investigators find Elena Zakotnova's body. The case caused a huge stir, given that such incidents were very rare in the Soviet Union at the time. A special team is even organized to investigate the crime. Chikatilo is also heard by the investigators, but they do not consider him a potential suspect. And this despite the fact that his house is located a few steps from the place where the body was found, despite the precedents, and above all, despite the reports of the neighbors who could not stand that individual with such strange and slippery ways. A 25-year-old young man, Alexander Kravchenko, will be arrested for that horrendous murder. The boy will always proclaim himself innocent, but will be executed for that crime in 1984. Chikatilo comes out of this story clean, but the very fact that he was interrogated and compared to such a crime puts him in very strong agitation, as well as creating a further rift between him and the rest of society. After this first brutal murder, in any case, Chikatilo seems to settle down, at least in his public life. Unpleasant episodes at school are reduced, but do not disappear, and above all, there are no more victims. We do not know if that diabolical act quenched his bloodthirsty, or if, more simply, being touched by the investigation frightened the former professor. However, in 1981, the didactic manager of the school, where he works, takes advantage of a staff cut to get rid of that strange character, who begins to become more and more uncomfortable. Chikatilo is then hired as a clerk in the supply department of a local company. With the job, he also gets a council house near the factory. This new job allows him to travel a lot, and a new world opens up for Chikatilo. Now he can manage his free time with greater autonomy, and above all, his travels allow him to stay away from home without having to account for his movements to anyone. And during one of his business trips, the monster still comes out into the open. At the Rostov bus station, Chikatilo meets Larissa Kachenko, a 17-year-old girl. He convinces her to follow him to a secluded area, probably offering her some money to have sex. But when she protests at the violent way she is slipping her hands between her panties, the monster goes wild. He hits the girl in the head and wraps his hands around the poor girl's neck. Eventually, Chikatilo's bestial pleasure manifests itself when the girl dies in agony in her arms. After that, she doesn't pay for what she did by biting her nipple. The second murder represents a notable escalation for Chikatilo. This time, in fact, he did not act in delirium. He carefully planned his criminal action and carried it out in a methodical and controlled way. He only let himself go in the final, when he felt the irrepressible urge to bite the breast of the still warm corpse. After performing his bestial actions, Chikatilo settles down, checks that he hasn't left any clues near the body, and leaves, as if nothing had happened. The body will be found the next day. The second murder marks the point of no return for Chikatilo. Now the fear of being arrested has disappeared. All that remains is the desire to return to taste the blood of his victims. The man has disappeared, only the monster remains. In June '82, he was the turn of Lyuba Buryk, a girl of just 13 years. The little girl meets Chikatilo as she walks to the bus station. The monster convinces her to take a shortcut through the woods, but as soon as the two have left the main road, Chikatilo mercilessly slaughters her with her knife. Eventually, the girl's body will be battered by 40 stab wounds. After that, Chikatilo covers the corpse and returns to the main road calm and peaceful. The poor girl's body will only be found 2 weeks later in horrendous conditions. The other murders were not long in coming. On the 25th of July '82, during a business trip to the Krasnodar region, Chikatilo brutally and inhumanly killed Lyuba Volyubova, a 14-year-old girl. And on August 13th, it is the turn of Oleg Pozadayev, a 9-year-old boy. This is the first male victim of the monster who, after killing the child, removes the genitals from the corpse and takes them with him. The boy's remains will never be found. On August 16th, however, Olga Kuprina, 13, is killed. In September, the victims are named Ira Karabelenkova, 19, and Sergei Kuzmin, 16. Finally, in December, it is the turn of Olga Stalmachenik, just 10 years old. The girl was supposed to go home by bus, but unfortunately, a mechanical breakdown forces her to go on foot. She will never go home. Her body will only be found 4 months later. Chikatilo, after having massacred her, removes her heart and carries it with him like a macabre trophy. Chapter 5. The Path in the Woods Operation. This escalation of horror does not go unnoticed. The Soviet police, however disorganized and in disarray within a general situation of political disintegration, cannot ignore it. The forces of law and order are therefore organizing to capture the person responsible for those massacres. It is immediately clear to everyone that these are not normal crimes. There is something more behind that trail of blood that is shaking the region. The modus operandi connects virtually all murders. Beyond the locations where the crimes occur, almost all the corpses were stabbed around the eyes, a very rare detail that is almost the signature of the mysterious serial killer. The weapon is also always the same, as established unequivocally by the expert reports. Thus the Operation Path in the Woods starts, a name that underlines the trait common to all those crimes. All the corpses were found near paths in the woods. Of course, everything happens without the knowledge of public opinion. In the Soviet Union, quite simply, certain things do not exist and cannot exist, and so the party silences everything. The investigators immediately realize that they are facing a very difficult case. In fact, it is clear that the victims have no connection with each other. It seems clear that the killer randomly chooses his prey without any concern for their sex, age, or other details which, in such cases, can be very useful for investigations. The agents, in this first phase of the investigation, suspect that the monster simply acts when he feels he has the opportunity to get away with it, without first preparing his murders. A very complicated situation for the police who, in fact, are unable to identify any suspects. Many of Chikatilo's victims are children of very humble, marginalized people who were barely identifiable in the Soviet Union at the time. It was almost always a question of social pariahs, invisible, expendable pawns whose fate nobody cared about. Probably this was the real factor of choice of the monster, who had learned to move between the flaws of the Soviet system, exploiting those weaknesses and making them his strengths. This choice of low-profile victims recalls, albeit in completely different ways, the actions of the Italian Unabomber, the mad bomber who sowed terror for 20 years between Veneto and Friuli. No striking cases, no illustrious victims, no deadly bombs, but only many small marginal episodes which, when added together, generated terror. The case of Chikatilo is very different, but there is no doubt that choosing his victims among the humblest strata of the population is a very specific choice on the part of the butcher of Rostov, who in this way ensures greater freedom of action and feels more sheltered from investigation. In the meantime, the help of the local section of the KGB is also requested, but the investigators do not arrive at anything concrete. Moreover, no Soviet investigative structure of the time was able to deal with such an investigation due to the absolute lack of specialization in this field. While the Soviet investigators and the KGB were formidable in investigating political crimes or in combating drug trafficking, which were considered a Western depravity, they were completely inexperienced in the fight against isolated and lonely criminals like the serial killer. Meanwhile, Chikatilo lives increasingly dissociated from his family and work. He finds peace only during trips away from the eyes of his colleagues who, according to him, spend their time staring at him and mocking him. At home the situation is certainly not the best, since Chikatilo goes out as soon as he can to wander in search of victims, or simply in search of subjects on which to then unleash his fantasies. In practice, Chikatilo is never at home, and even when he is there he completely ignores his wife. The summer of 1983 is particularly important in our history, and not just because the monster wakes up and kills again. In fact, Vladimir Kazakov, an official of the Ministry of the Interior, is sent from Moscow to Rostov. Kazakov studies the case carefully and fixes his attention on those wounds around the eyes that come back in almost all corpses. One of the big problems with this investigation is that the bodies are found, when they are found, many months after the murders. Consequently, investigations are very difficult because the crime scenes in these conditions are now irremediably corrupt. In any case, now that all the murders are linked together, and we begin to understand that there is only one hand behind that absurd madness, we can speak of a turning point. For the Soviet forces of order now everything changes, a real manhunt begins. Meanwhile, Chikatilo has never stopped. On the 18th of June 1983, a young Armenian girl, Laura Sarkisian, disappears. Her body will never be found again, and even if Chikatilo is later acquitted for this charge, everyone agrees that she too is attributing this mysterious disappearance to him. Irina Dunenkova, a 13-year-old girl with severe mental retardation, was killed in July at the Rostov Aviators Park. A few days later the victim is Lyudmila Kukshuba, a 24-year-old vagabond. In August, Igor Gudkov, a boy of just 7, is killed once again in the Rostov Aviators Park. He is the youngest victim among those of the Rostov butcher. From this moment on it is practically impossible to follow the rhythm of the Rostov monster. Her thirst for blood seems unstoppable. Valentina Kukulina, Vera Sevkin, Sergei Markov, Natalia Selopinina, Marta Ryabenko, Dmitry Tishnikov, Tatiana Petrosian, Svetlana Petrosian, Elena Bakulina, Dmitry Illarionov, Anna Lemesheva, Svetlana Sana, Natalia Golashovskali, Akiva Alexander Chepel, Irina Leshinskaya. In fact, from September 1983 until November 1990, Chikatilo massacres another 39 people. Women, men, girls, boys. The monster seems to hit at random, without any logic, leaving behind only a trail of blood that seems to never end. In the meantime, the investigations continue and several suspects are also interrogated and arrested. But each time the killer strikes, thus clearing the suspect on duty. For the police it is all to be redone. In his role as a serial killer, Chikatilo seems to be impregnable. He acts without leaving traces by systematically outwitting the police who investigate his crimes. On the professional front, however, things are very different. In February 1984, Andrei Chikatilo was formally indicted for theft against the state for a trivial matter linked to a business trip. Anyone else would have safely escaped that accusation, but he explodes, goes completely into crisis, and does not even try to defend himself. In that period, needless to say, he intensified his activity as a predator and vented anger and frustration against innocent victims. It is during this time that the police managed to get their hands on evidence that will later prove decisive for his arrest. After the discovery of the body of Dima Tishnikov, a 10-year-old boy, a witness reports seeing the boy in the company of a man of about 50 who dragged his leg. In addition, a partial print was found on the scene of the crime. For the first time, the police have a concrete lead, as well as a plausible description of the killer. In May 1984, one of the most brutal murders in Chikatilo's long list took place. The butcher from Rostov, although he lived in an unsustainable situation to say the least, had managed to forge a relationship with a woman, a certain Tatiana Petrosyan. Petrosyan had known Chikatilo since 1978, and in the end she had become her lover. Despite the extramarital affair that seems to appease his bestial instincts, the former Ukrainian professor, however, does not resist for long. On May 25, 1984, he stabs and massacres the poor woman with a hammer. But the nightmare is not over yet, because immediately after it is the turn of Svetlana, Petrosyan's 11-year-old daughter, who is killed with unprecedented violence. The bodies will be found at 2 different times more than a month later, now reduced to obscene conditions. In fact, Chikatilo had fun beheading the poor girl and throwing her head about 10 meters from her body. After the work report, Chikatilo leaves Shakhty for good, returns to Rostov, and finds a new job. His horrendous daily life continues without particular ups and downs. That monstrous being continues immersed in an absolute grayness. Nobody notices, nobody seems to be interested in that bizarre character. For his part, he avoids fraternizing with colleagues and acquaintances. He just ignores his family and spends all his free time looking for new victims. It seems almost impossible that such a mediocre person could have managed to massacre so many people without making mistakes, without leaving clues or traces that could frame him. Yet, as we have also been able to underline by analyzing other cases, he is certainly not an evil genius or who knows what enlightened mind. Meanwhile, the police have nothing in hand, no leads, no suspects. Nothing at all. Only a partial trace and a brief description. Virtually nothing, indeed. Many of the corpses have not yet been found, and therefore we are not even sure of the actual count of the victims. Chapter 6. A Cracking World. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev burst into the Soviet political scenario forcefully. The wind has changed, and even the newspapers are freer thanks to the glasnost, the freedom of the press ensured by the new leader. The Russians then begin to discover that a serial killer is wandering among them, something that until a few years before seemed to say the least unthinkable. Attention, this is a simple paragraph published in a local newspaper, but for a country like the Soviet Union, accustomed to a harsh regime that controlled every detail in a maniacal way, those few lines have enormous significance, and this is what the population he understands immediately. In this regard, let's read what Malo, the newspaper of the local Communist Party, wrote in September 1984, or a few days after the discovery of the body of little Alexander Chepel, an 11-year-old boy killed and tortured by the Rostov butcher. A child was brutally killed, Sasha Chepel, but we assure the population that the killer will be caught in a very short time. Unfortunately, the journalists' hopes turn out to be in vain. Chikatilo continues to kill undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. Kazakov, sent from Moscow to the Don to try to solve the problem, realizes that the investigations up to that moment have been conducted with incredible lightness, so much so that often the remains of the victims have not even been collected and analyzed properly. It was in September 1984 that the most paradoxical fact of this story took place. On the 13th, to be precise, Inspector Zanazovsky stopped a suspiciously behaving man who was walking around the streets of Rostov. It must be said that the Soviet police were obsessed with that unstoppable serial killer who continued to act undisturbed. That is why a disproportionate number of men had been stopped and questioned over the years. But it had all been useless, a collection of holes in the water. 2. Even the man stopped on that cold September morning seems like yet another miss. Yes, he has something to do with him, but he is a citizen of the Communist Party, married and with 2 children. In short, one like many. But we know that man well. His name is Andrei Chikatilo. The butcher from Rostov is displaced, he feels uneasy, but, surprisingly, he manages to remain calm. Zanazovsky continues not to see clearly, and then decides to do some additional analyses. The goal is to compare the data with the results obtained by analyzing the sperm found in the anus of Sergei Markov, a 14-year-old boy who was massacred with 70 stab wounds and whose genitals had been removed in December 1983. At this point, the unthinkable happens. Chikatilo is subjected to blood tests, and it is ascertained that his blood group is A, while the sperm found on the corpse is of group AB. From a theoretical point of view, it is possible that a person has blood and sperm from 2 different groups. It is true that these are very rare cases, but the Soviet police do not even ask themselves the problem. At this point, Chikatilo, who, it should be remembered, is only one of the many suspects arrested by the investigators, is released after 3 months in prison. Over the next 6 months, Chikatilo seems to have calmed down and does not suffer any victims. Probably the 3 months spent in the cell have scared him, or maybe he is able to hold back the monster inside him. He also finds a new job and seems to resume his gray, everyday life once again. In 1985 he will kill, only twice. 3 other murders in 1987 and 2 in 1988. Between 1989 and 1990, the murderous rampage of Chikatilo exploded, and there were even 14 murders. It almost seems that the fear of arrest is now forgotten. Now the monster is free to act undisturbed, without inhibitions. In the last period of freedom, Chikatilo concentrates his fury above all towards men. As many as 14 of his last 20 victims are in fact male. Meanwhile, the investigations continue, now with a new investigator in charge of the entire Sentiero del Bosco operation. Vladimir Kazakov, who as we have remembered until then was in charge of the investigations, becomes the deputy of Isa Kostoyev, who takes control of the hunt for the serial killer. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is crumbling and the whole world is witnessing the final end of the Iron Curtain. 1989 is a pivotal year for world history. Perestroika is rampant with its unstoppable force and upsets the Soviet Union. The country is a powder keg, and from all sides we are witnessing that epochal change with a feeling halfway between joy and fear. The revolutionary situation makes investigations into Chikatilo even more difficult and precarious. The country is literally dissolving, and in the face of what is happening, the capture of the Rostov monster no longer seems to be a priority. But after the initial emotion and joy, the first problems begin. 1990 is a very hard year for the Russian people, who live on their skin all the consequences of the collapse of a system and an apparatus which, despite the 1,000 evident defects, guaranteed its citizens a minimum subsistence. Now that system no longer exists, and people notice it very quickly. In this scenario of rubble, Chikatilo unleashes his fury in a bestial way. 1990, in fact, will be one of his years of greatest activity with 8 victims, second only to 1984, when the monster had massacred as many as 15 people. The Soviet Union is in disarray, and Chikatilo seems to have forgotten the old fears. Chapter 7. The End. On November 7, 1990, Chikatilo was stopped again. Sergeant Rybakov, recently assigned to the Path in the Woods operation, finds himself near the Donlashov station when he sees a man in his 50s suddenly emerging from the woods. The man stops to wash his hands at a fountain, and then starts walking towards the sergeant as if nothing had happened. The agent becomes suspicious and decides to stop that strange character for a checkup, who also had an obvious red spot on his face, a wounded finger bandaged to perfection, and his clothes all muddy and in disorder. However, after a brief check of the documents, Chikatilo is let go without problems. On the 13th of the same month, however, a new victim of the Rostov monster was found in the woods just behind the Donlashov station. This is Svetlana Korostik, a 22-year-old woman whose tongue and breasts were removed by Chikatilo to take them with her. From the autopsy, it emerges that the girl must have been killed no more than a week earlier, and a detail that made Kostoyev and the agents following the case furious: it was the fourth murder of the monster in that area. The fourth grade is given to all the agents who were in the area at that time, and of course, the name of Andrei Chikatilo appears once again, that very strange gentleman that Sergeant Rybakov had stopped in Donlashav's a few days earlier. Could it be just a coincidence? The agents prefer to see clearly, and so they decide to do a more thorough check. It is verified that a certain Andrei Chikatilo had already been involved in the investigations in 1984, and even if the man had been released, the attention of the investigators immediately became very high. There are too many very suspicious coincidences. It is clear to everyone that there is something wrong. It cannot all be just the result of chance. A detailed analysis is made, and the pieces of the puzzle finally begin to match. The long period without homicides, which coincides with the 3 months in prison and the subsequent release of Chikatilo, the proximity of at least 2 of his workplaces to the places where 5 bodies were found, the suspicions that led to the first arrest. Too many clues, too many suspicious coincidences. Kostoyev decides to put the gray, humble-looking man under close surveillance. Meanwhile, Chikatilo no longer kills, he seems to have stopped. On November 20th, however, the police tried everything out and arrested him, despite having nothing concrete in his hands. It is a gamble, sure, but at this point the agents are at stake. The interrogations begin, and Chikatilo appears to be at least a disturbed person. He randomly answers the questions he is asked, as if he were talking to himself. His sentences are inconsistent. He even talks about himself in the third person, calling himself a coward, and then adding that he deserves punishment. From his side, however, no admission arrives. In the meantime, blood tests are repeated, and once again, there is no correspondence with the finding found at the scene of one of the crimes. From a certain point on, however, Chikatilo no longer speaks. On the contrary, he makes a completely delusional and meaningless statement in which in fact he proclaims himself a political prisoner. I believe I am being persecuted by the investigating authorities for writing letters of protest to various officials about the illegal activities of other officials in the Shakti region, who have decided to build garages in the house where my son lives. What is Chikatilo talking about? At first no one understands anything, then it is ascertained that it is an old condominium dispute that had involved Chikatilo's son, a dispute that no one knew anything about and which, moreover, did not interest anyone. Chikatilo resists a few more days, then on the 27th he begins to confess and issues a first disturbing statement. They arrested me on November 20th, 1990, and I have been in custody ever since. I want to tell everything with sincerity. I am in a state of deep depression, and I admit that I have disturbed sexual impulses, which is why I have committed certain actions. In the past, I tried to be helped by a psychiatrist for my violent headaches, lack of memory, insomnia, and my sexual problems. However, the treatments I received and the exercises I put into practice did not yield any results. I have a wife and 2 children, but I suffer from a particular sexual infirmity, impotence. People make fun of me because I have moments of bewilderment. Sometimes I don't realize that I'm masturbating, and I only find out because whoever saw me tells me about it later. I feel humiliated. People make fun of me in the workplace and in other situations. I have felt humiliated since childhood and have always suffered. At school, I was very skinny for work and walked around badly dressed. Everyone was angry with me. But I studied so intensely that at times I even lost consciousness. I graduated. I wanted to prove what I was worth in the job, and I did my best. Colleagues were aware of my work but took advantage of it because I am weak. Now that I am elderly, the sexual aspect is no longer so important to me, but my problems remain, and they are all mental. When I practiced perverse sexual acts, I felt a kind of mystical, uncontrollable rage. From an early age, I felt helpless as a man and as a person. What I did not do to feel sexual pleasure, but because it was the only way to quiet my mind and my soul. And above all, after seeing pornographic films, what I did after seeing pornographic videos with scenes of perverse and cruel sex. It seems clear that Chikatilo is playing the card of mental illness, but the agents are not there and continue to press him. Eventually, the monster collapses completely. I am ready to testify about the crimes I have committed, but please don't torment me with the details because my mind could not bear them. I only feel gratitude towards the investigating bodies who arrested me. From this moment on, Chikatilo is a river in flood. He confesses everything to the police, relives the 54 murders one by one, murders of which he remembers everything. Dates, times, details. Every single episode was catalogued in his sick mind. The agents thus become aware of many unpublished details that allow them to find the bodies of numerous victims who until then were considered simple cases of missing persons. In many cases, the crimes were not in the least related to each other by the police. In other cases, even the bodies had not been found and therefore, it was not even suspected that the crime had occurred. Then in the spring, the monster personally accompanies the agents to the crime sites and helps them to recover the corpses or what remains of them. The trips are so numerous and so distributed in different Russian regions that it takes a year before the macabre tour in search of the remains of the bodies tortured by the monster ends. There are also those who argue that Chikatilo feels almost a macabre pleasure in returning escorted by the police to the places of his horrendous crimes. We consider the testimony of Police Major Viktor Denisenko, the man in charge of the escort who accompanied the butcher from Rostov to the places of his crimes, to be very interesting in this regard. In the Bagaisk region, an investigator had buried a float in the place where a body was found in the middle of the brush. The float is an empty bottle into which a sheet with the few data available is inserted: the description of the victim's appearance, any clothing, and the date of discovery. Then the exact spot where he was buried is noted on a map. When we got there, Chikatilo said without hesitation, "He is here." Then there was a bit of confusion, because the agent who had buried the float had lost the map. "It doesn't matter, it's here," Chikatilo claimed, "start digging." When the float was finally found, we realized that Chikatilo was just 6 meters wrong. Another time in Revda, we were looking for a victim whose body had never been found. It was a child who disappeared 5 years earlier, just in the period when Chikatilo was in that area for work reasons. We started from Revda station, walked 4 kilometers across the Chusavaja River, and then up the wooded Volsika mountain. That area is all the same, but despite this, Chikatilo stopped at a certain point and said, "I think it's here. But I can be wrong. Search within 100 meters. He was wrong. To be exact, 136 steps. After digging quite a bit, we found the remains of a child and a sock that the mother recognized. Calling himself a misfit, Chikatilo even attempted to explain the crimes he committed. But I think he didn't need either explanations or justifications. He was never sorry for what he had done. The feeling is that he entered the wood and a man came out, while inside the wood, face to face with the victim, there was another man, much more like an animal. He himself said at once, "When I came out of the strip of wood, everything remained behind me, behind who knows what imaginary and inviolable line." In April 1992, while Russia is falling apart and numerous states have already separated and declared their independence, the trial of the butcher in Rostov begins. Right from the start, there is the perception of being faced with an absolutely unprecedented event in Russian history. Never before had a detainee aroused such popular indignation, never had a trial turned into an open-door show, even followed by many foreign press correspondents. Chikatilo then takes a lot of him to make it even more spectacular, with his crazy look and his absolutely unpredictable behavior in the classroom. He himself, who had always been blocked by a practically pathological shyness, now seems to be an actor born eager to have all the lights of the stage for himself. Here is an example of his crazy statements in the courtroom. You all worry about useless things. What do you think he may have done? I am not a homosexual, I have milk in my chest, and I am about to give birth. When he can speak, he unleashes paranoid tirades of a political nature, defends himself by citing the Great Russian Famine, and then comes to speak of his impotence as well, even lowering his pants and underwear in the courtroom. Sometimes in his delusions he presents himself as a benefactor, a man who has freed society from parasites, prostitutes, and useless people. Other times he prefers to wear the clothes of a martyr. Perhaps with that insane and hysterical clown behavior inside that cage that made him sadly famous, Chikatilo hopes to be judged mentally ill, and therefore saved from the gallows. However, the court rejects any psychiatric examination, something quite common in Russia at the time, which aims to use justice as a propaganda tool to try to hide the many limits of the political situation resulting from the breakup of the Soviet Union. The court therefore found Chikatilo sane, and in October 1992 sentenced him to death. In consideration of the horrendous crimes of which this court has been guilty, this court can only award him the only punishment he deserves, which is why I sentence him to death. On February 14, 1994, Chikatilo was executed in the Rostov prison with a blow to the back of the head, as La Republika writes. According to what was learned yesterday from Russian police sources, the execution of the monster took place with a gunshot to the back of the head. Last week, President Boris Yeltsin rejected the request for a pardon. Chikatilo's lawyer had repeatedly tried to prove that his client was mentally ill, but in vain. A special psychiatric commission had in fact expressed a contrary opinion in this regard. At the trial, the Rostov Regional Court accused the police of inefficiency due to the manhunt unleashed in search of Chikatilo, an investigation which required the use of 50 special investigators and at least 500 police officers. The absurd and incredible epic of the Rostov butcher has finally come to an end. But not everyone is sure that the monster was really killed. Let's try to understand why. Chapter 8. After Death. In 2004, the Italian director David Grieco brought the story of Andrei Chikatilo to the cinema. Evelenko is the title of the film that tells this dramatic story, with a great Malcolm McDowell as the butcher from Rostov. The film, inspired by the book The Communist Who Ate the Children, written by Grieco himself, is very far from the reality of the facts and takes on the typical connotations of fiction, even if, a detail of no small importance, Grieco worked for a long time on the life of Chikatilo, and he also witnessed the last part of the process firsthand. However, the Italian author comes to the hypothesis that Chikatilo was able to subjugate his victims only with the force of his gaze. Grieco's film, however, in addition to hypothesizing that Chikatilo had some sort of hypnotic or evil telepathic power, ends with a sentence that insinuates a shocking hypothesis. Andrei Romanovich Evelenko was found sane and guilty. He was officially executed on February 14, 1994. The execution took place, no one knows where, no one knows how. At Christmas 1993, two research institutes, one German and one American, had offered the former Soviet Union large sums of money for it. I live. What really happened? In fact, there are strong doubts about the date of the execution, given that despite the fact that the appeal process had already been granted, Chikatilo was still executed, officially in Novocherkassk, a village of 4 houses on the cross lost in the Russian countryside. That execution represented the end of a nightmare for the Russian population, given that, as we had the opportunity to tell the trial of the butcher in Rostov, it had had a crazy media coverage all over the world. Yet not a video of the execution, no photos. No correspondent to tell about that historical moment, and no journalist present at the execution of one of the most famous criminals of the 20th century. The following day, a cold news dispatch communicated to the world that the sentence had been carried out. End of the story. Grieco, who asked him if Chikatilo had actually been sold, alive, to some foreign company interested in studying his brain, replied as follows. In my opinion, yes, he was an exceptional character, he hypnotized the victims, he was followed by them, and years later, he was able to tell the investigators exactly every detail of his crimes. This is a story that far exceeds the imagination. Of course, there is no evidence to support this theory, which many have dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. However, the fact that the Russian authorities did not exploit the execution of Chikatilo for propaganda purposes remains an anomaly. Everyone remembers the photo of Ted Bundy's coffin leaving prison after the execution in the electric chair, and history is full of excellent corpses exhibited by the political power of the moment to make the most of the propaganda aspect of these events. We are also talking about a country that for decades had been a master in the use of propaganda, a country in which everything was scrutinized and controlled, all documented and recorded. Then in 1994, Russia was going through a period of very severe economic and social crisis. Is it possible that the authorities did not take advantage of that justicialist moment to obtain greater consensus? Those who are against this thesis argue that the authorities have deliberately chosen to maintain a low profile to avoid further fueling a story that had been handled very badly by the police. A sort of cover-up to silence what for years had been a real thorn in the side of the former Soviet Union. Undoubtedly, before perestroika, things would have been handled like this, but it is difficult to hypothesize that such behavior was carried out even after the revolution that had eliminated the Soviet Empire. Unfortunately, until any new evidence emerges from the Soviet archives, we can never be sure of how things actually went, although the official version seems to all intents and purposes the most solid and real one, net of the narrative charm that they may have so-called alternative theories. After the trial and sentencing, what happened to Chikatilo's family? His wife was repeatedly interviewed, both by the press and by the police, and she repeatedly said she never suspected anything. Of course, her husband was a strange person with obvious sexual problems, but he could never have imagined having such a monster at his side. Moreover, it is a recurring element in literature, given that many serial killers were considered by all acquaintances to be very normal people, the classic good guys. This was certainly not the case with Chikatilo, who had nevertheless shown several times that he suffered from a disturbed sexuality, but no one could ever have imagined that such an abyss of ferocity was hidden behind that mild and submissive air. From a formal point of view, the woman divorced Chikatilo in 1989, and after the scandal, she had to quit her job in a local daycare center. She later found a job in Kharkiv. The children changed their surname and chose that of their mother for obvious reasons of confidentiality and also of security, given that many of the relatives of the victims of Chikatilo in the courtroom had sworn to take revenge. Lyudmila, the eldest daughter born in 1965, got married, had 2 children, and chose to always remain very far from the spotlight, keeping a low profile that is more than understandable. His son Yuri fought with the Russian army in Afghanistan, where he also sustained a wound. He was later jailed for 2 months for illegally stealing material from the army. Back in Russia, he served 2 years of probation for crimes committed in the army, then finally found a job in a factory in Novorosiysk. He returned to live with his mother in the late 1990s, when the scandal of his father's arrest had now become a matter of public knowledge at an international level. In 1996 he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for extortion, and in 1998, just 4 months after being released from prison, he was arrested again for robbery. He got out of jail in 2004 and started his own business. But things haven't improved much for him, quite the opposite. In fact, on the 9th of April 2009, a man was hospitalized in Kharkiv Hospital, Ukraine, with severe knife wounds in the abdomen and right hand. This is a young man in his 30s, most likely a drug addict, who claimed to have been attacked by a stranger. He managed to escape the attack, and after stealing the mysterious assailant's car, he headed to the hospital. The car belonged to Yuri Odnichov, the son of Andrei Chikatilo, who defended himself by saying that it was the drug addict who stole his car. The investigation revealed a long history of conflicts and complaints between the two. A difficult life, that of Yuri. After all, it could not be otherwise with a father like that. Despite everything, Yuri has never denied or hidden that he is the son of the butcher from Rostov, On the contrary, he is proud of it, and claims that his father was a victim of the Russian police who, unable to solve many murders, found the right owl to buckle. Blame. In honor of his father, Yuri named his son Andrei. Is the monster's brain in Japan? Yuri is a major proponent of the theory that Chikatilo was not actually executed. According to him, he was sold to Japan. In this regard, let's read what he said in an interview released in 2009. I have researched a lot about my father's exploits in recent years. His lawyer had filed an appeal against the verdict, but no one considered it in the least. They all turned away, pretending not to see. The exact date and place of the execution were never disclosed. Indeed, the sources on these details are very diverse. My mother was the last of us to see him, since a meeting was organized before he was executed for the two of them to see each other for the last time. Even when I called to have my father's body, I was replied in an irreverent way that his brain had been sent to Japan. Chapter 9. Nightmare. Chikatilo's is a horrifying and in many ways unrepeatable story in a modern country. The scenario, the decline and the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was its background, has not existed for many years. But if on the one hand we cannot exclude such and many inaccuracies in the investigations even nowadays at any latitude, in the same way we are sure that in no country with a structured company such a story can remain relegated to newspaper blurbs of the province. The internet and the new means of communication have also made a definitive change in the way law enforcement agencies investigate, which is why we cannot imagine the repetition of such a story. All this, however, provided that you live in a state where the internet and the free circulation of information are guaranteed and sanctioned by law. But we know that there are not a few so-called emerging countries or the Islamic area in which these rights are not recognized at all. Indeed, they are bitterly fought by the local political power. More information at every level of the population would certainly have contributed to the early resolution of this case, thus bringing to justice a monster like Chikatilo years ahead of how things actually went. Finally, the controversy over the alleged failure to execute the Rostov butcher is certainly not very credible. If it is clear that Chikatilo had particular gifts in remembering precise details and locations of his countless crimes, it is equally unlikely that any country could have been interested in studying his pathology in detail. Keeping Chikatilo in captivity to study him as a laboratory guinea pig would have made it possible to better reconstruct his criminal parable and to analyze his mental pathology with greater precision, but not much more. From this analysis, no useful details would have emerged to solve cases such as that of the monster of Florence in Italy or of the Zodiac in the United States, and investigators around the world know this all too well. Chikatilo is the classic serial killer who can thrive only in a specific social context, such as that of the former Soviet Empire. A context in which the family resembles a closed nucleus in which any frustration or psychosis is covered up and hidden at any price. A context in which an institutional, political, or religious power keeps everyone under control and conditions daily life even in the smallest activities, trying to hide and repress any deviance within it. A context in which the freedom of the press and of opinion is severely limited. Do you know anyone? We do, unfortunately. Appendix. Cannibals in Russia, 30 years later. 30 years after the incredible story of Andrei Chikatilo, Russia was once again shocked by a history of cannibalism. This time we are in Krasnodar, a city of about 800,000 inhabitants located in southern Russia. The protagonist of this absurd story is Dmitry Bakshev, a thin, bald man, one of those who when you see them you think that he no longer has a health problem. He and his wife Natalia, a nurse from the military academy, have killed and eaten their victims undisturbed for more than 20 years. Also this time we are faced with an emblematic case of bad management of the investigations by the police, given that the two serial killers were discovered almost by chance. In fact, Dmitry lost his mobile phone on the street. The police found it, and when he opened it, the phone wasn't even protected by a password. To see who it belonged to, he found a series of slightly chilling photos. One in particular shocked the investigators, as Eduardo Montoli said. There he smiles. And behind him, piled up in a bucket, what remains of a woman, dismembered into several parts. Dmitri tries to defend himself as he can, but his statements are neither in heaven nor on earth. But no, he was just a selfie, I swear. That was there and I took a picture, that's all. The police want to see clearly and immediately decide to carry out a search inside the house of that hallucinating character. Inside Dmitri and Natalia's refrigerator, the police find 7 sacks of well-preserved meat ready to eat. All normal, the two say, it is normal meat stored in the fridge. Too bad that is human flesh, as the police find out very quickly. 30 years after Andrei Chikatilo's nightmare, therefore, the Russian police forces find themselves having to deal with the horror of cannibalism once again. What emerges from the reconstructions of the police is a story that literally freezes the blood in the veins. The police are unable to trace the exact number of victims. The official ones will be 12, but it is suspected that in total Dmitri and Natalia have killed and devoured more than 30 people. The details of this story are, however, nothing short of crazy. A photo is dated December 28, 1999. The image depicts a plate. Above is the head of a woman with a lemon in her nose, olives in her eyes, and a large number of mandarins all around her. Elena B., a colleague of the Academy of Natalia, who disappeared into thin air, identified her as such. In the pantry, there is a jar with sliced human skin. Just like Chikatilo, Dmitri and Natalia also confess almost everything, given that the exact number of victims will remain strong doubts. The couple recruited potential victims on online dating sites, the hunting ground for many serial killers of the new millennium. More and more gruesome details emerge from the investigations, such as the testimony of a neighbor of the couple. He often made meat pies. She said that she did it to raise some extra money, there she sold to friends and acquaintances. And he took care of the canteen of the military school. They have always taken advantage of the fact that the police in Russia pay little attention to missing persons. The country is huge and you can't deal with everything. No corpse, no investigation. And so the horror family has been able to move around undisturbed for years, cultivating its unbridled perversions, killing and eating dozens of innocent people.